Hello, Professor Cicerelli here. So today I want to talk about the next conspiracy we've been looking at, which is the UFO conspiracy, specifically the UFO conspiracy in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. And what we've been looking at so far in this section is a couple of primary sources. So we looked at some secondary sources, we looked at some primary sources, combination of both. And the last two primary sources that we looked at, one was what was known as the Twining Memo. This is a document supposedly written by General Nathan Twining to a man named George Sullivan, whose name is here on the screen, you can see. So we looked at that primary source. Now, I call it a primary source because if it's authentic, then it's coming right from somebody who was there at the time and had access to certain information at the time. The other document we looked at that was a primary source was what's sometimes called the Eisenhower Memo, or the Eisenhower Briefing. And this was a document that also, if authentic, shows that there is some fishy stuff going on in Roswell at the time. Also a primary source. You'll notice that it's dated 1952, so a little bit after the Twining Memo of 1947. But both of these documents talk about different things relating to this UFO conspiracy. This document, the Twining Memo, discusses flying discs, so-called flying discs. It is reporting the experiences of people who were in Roswell at the time and their stories, and this general says that it's his opinion that these phenomenon are real. They're not imaginary. They involve flying objects that are the size of man-made aircraft, so they're big. Okay. He says it's possible that they are caused by natural phenomena, such as meteors or other things, shooting stars, but that these reports of these flying objects, these flying discs, they're metallic looking. He goes on in the document to say that they travel at high speeds. So what we'd want to do if we were researching this conspiracy thoroughly is we'd want to know for sure if this document is authentic. Did General Nathan Twining really write this document? Okay, we had mentioned that this document and the other one that I just showed you, this one, are both part of a collection of documents that are sometimes called the Majestic 12 documents, or they're part of a finding of documents in the 80s that really shed some light on what was going on in Roswell in 1947. And what we'd want to do if we were doing serious research on this is to figure out whether these documents are authentic or not. Meaning, are they written by the people whose names are on them? Now, people have done all kinds of tests on these documents, like the typewriter marks. Are they consistent with typewriters at the time? People have done on the documents that were not photocopies, people have done paper analysis, ink analysis, all of these things. But not until one particular researcher named Michael Heiser, was there linguistic testing done on these documents. And so both of these are primary sources, and the secondary source that I wanted to just touch on briefly with you today is a secondary source called the Majestic Documents, a forensic linguistic report. And this came out in 2007, and this is by Michael Heiser, who by training is a biblical scholar and usually is used to, usually studying biblical texts. But he did an analysis, or he used the techniques of another scholar to do a linguistic analysis of those documents that I just showed you, and lots of other ones. And this secondary source that you see on screen here is his explanation of how he did the study and what his study showed. Okay, so the first part of his document is sort of an introduction to what the Majestic 12 documents are, how we came to get them. I highlighted this one paragraph in green because I want you to try to look at that paragraph. And this might be a good thing that we can do together, is have a look at that paragraph and see if you could summarize that paragraph. Remember, summarizing is shortening or condensing to about a sentence. Okay, so have a look at that paragraph and see if you could summarize it. Okay, let's read. And then one thing you should notice, and even before we read actually, is that some words keep appearing here, especially this abbreviation AFOSI, Majestic Documents. That's a key word that shows up in here. So when we're summarizing, our summary is probably going to include something about that. Okay, due to the explosive nature of their content, the Majestic Documents are considered by many to be the core evidence for a genuine extraterrestrial reality and alien visitation of planet Earth in the 20th century. United States government personnel have denied their authenticity, the Majestic Documents, primarily on an opinion rendered by AFOSI, or the U.S. Air Force Counterintelligence Office. The AFOSI report focused on certain features of the documents. It considered historically anachronous, so not fitting the time, and other historical inconsistencies. The charges of the AFOSI have been coherently rebutted or disputed, or proved incorrect. And so validation and debunking efforts have resulted. And so both validation and debunking efforts have resulted in a stalemate. So if we had to summarize this, what is this paragraph saying? Well, two different sides of the conspiracy. You've got the considered by many to be the core. These are considered by many to be the core evidence. So who are the people who are considering these to be core evidence? The people who are obviously in support of the UFO conspiracy. And then you have people from the U.S. government who've denied their authenticity. Okay? And what this paragraph is telling us is that UFO supporters think the Majestic 12 documents are authentic. The government denies that. But the government's denial, or the government's argument against the UFO conspiracy theorists, has also been rejected. So where does that put us? You've got arguments on one side by UFO supporters saying these documents are real, the government saying they're not real, but then the government's argument against the documents being real is that was also rejected or rebutted. So if we had to summarize this in one sentence, I would say UFO conspiracists think Majestic 12 documents authentic. Government denies it. However, both have been rejected. And so where does that leave us? Okay, that's just an exercise to do with that paragraph there. So like I said, this first part is really just an introduction to the Majestic 12 documents. It talks about how we got them. This section talks about some of the tests that have been done on them, okay, previously. Physical dating of the ink, comparison of the handwriting. I'm not sure actually how these tests came out, whether these tests showed that these documents were authentic to the time, meaning the paper is dated to the right age. If you're doing research on this, you'd want to know that. Okay, I'm not sure how those tests turned out. Okay. Skip this. But Heiser tells us that there's never been a linguistic analysis done on these documents. Okay, we showed all the other tests, but never has there been a linguistic test done on this. And a linguistic test is deciding whether the writing on it matches other writing from the person that we know that person's done. So in section 1.3, this is where he lays out, Heiser, the author, where he lays out how the study is going to work. Okay, so he mentions that the goal is going to be to determine whether the Majestic Documents that carry a signature were indeed written by the people to whom authorship is attributed. Another way of saying that is we're trying to figure out whether the people whose names are on these documents really wrote them. Okay, and he's going to use techniques developed by a linguist named Dr. Carol Chasky. He's going to use her techniques. Okay, and he points out before doing the study that it can only the tests or the methods for doing the research can only determine whether or not the content was written, whether the content that was written actually is attributable to that author. If we refute or are able to show that the authorship is a forgery, then we can assume that the content is also not accurate. Okay, so if we show that the person whose name is on that document didn't really write it, then what Heiser is telling us in this paragraph here is that we can probably assume that the information in it is also bogus. But he says the converse is not true, however. So just because we know, or if we can determine with our test that the person whose name is on the document really wrote it, that doesn't mean that the information in there is accurate. The person might be mistaken, in other words, right? So Heiser is saying, he's laying out for us that all this test is going to show. It's not going to show whether the information is authentic in the document, and that the person is 100% right. So when the document talks about alien bodies, as this one document does talk about, it's this one here, right? This Eisenhower Memo, this Eisenhower Briefing, talks about alien bodies. It talks about crash landed crafts. It talks about the weather balloon story that came out of Roswell in 1947 was a cover-up story. All of these claims in this document, we can't prove whether they're true or not. All we can prove, if we study this document, is whether this name on it, whether the person whose name is on it really wrote it. Now, one of the things that Heiser tells us, actually, and it's going to be a little bit of a disappointment, one of the things that Heiser tells us is that document that I just showed you, he's not going to be able to study that one. He's not going to be able to study that one, and it's for this reason he says here. He says the Eisenhower Briefing, that's the document I just showed you. He says, only those documents that specifically bear the name of a signatory author were considered for testing. Famous Majestic documents such as the Eisenhower Briefing is one I just showed you, for example, were not tested because there is no claim in the briefing as to the author of the briefing. So if you look at it, that document, pull it up again, it mentions Roscoe Hillenkotter on there, who's a real person. It mentions his name, but it doesn't mention that this document was actually prepared by him. Okay, his name is on it. It's not signed at the end. Okay, like that earlier document I showed you, the Twining document. That document's signed, has Twining's name at the end of it. This one does not have Hillenkotter's name at the end. Is not signed. So for that reason, Heiser doesn't use it in the test. I'd be interested to know whether anybody else has used or applied the linguistic tests to this. But it's possible that Hillenkotter himself didn't write this document, but gave information to somebody else who prepared it. And so what Heiser is saying is, I'm not going to bother testing it because I might be testing somebody else's handwriting here. Okay, so he tells us that, But he is, however, going to test that Twining memo. This one. He is going to test this one. Because this one, as I said, I don't have the page on here, but the last page of this document has Nathan Twining's signature on it. Has he's signing off at the end of the document saying that, this is his. So Heiser is going to test this one. Okay, and what we're going to see is what his test shows. Okay. And it'll be interesting if his test shows that that document's authentic, because that document mentions flying discs, etc. Okay. So how is he going to do this test? Here's what he's going to do. What he's going to do is he's got a bunch of documents that he's not sure about, that came up in the Majestic 12 documents that he wants to test. And so one of them is the one I just showed you, the Nathan Twining document written to George Solgen, General George Solgen. Okay? That's one of the ones he wants to test. And so what he's going to do is he's going to take these documents, all of the ones that are in this chart here, that he says are unverified, meaning we don't know whether they're authentic or not. We're going to try and find out. And what we're going to do is we're going to compare them to documents that we know these people wrote. Okay? So each one of these, so if you look at all these FDR documents, all these documents written that we know Franklin Delano Roosevelt wrote, they go into what's called the FDR pool, or the pool that makes up FDR's handwriting. Okay, not handwriting, his language use. Okay, so all of these documents make up the collection that's the FDR pool. Okay? All of these documents that we know Harry Truman wrote go into the Harry Truman pool that we know he wrote, so that we can test the documents, the unknown ones, these, against the known ones. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing with Nathan Twining. We have two documents that we know he wrote. Okay, one of them is quite long. They're both kind of long, thousands of words. Okay. And we're going to use Nathan Twining's word choice, his sentence structure, all of this to test and see whether that document, this document here, whether he actually wrote that or not. Okay? That's what we're going to do. Okay. So Heiser does his test. Here's what his test shows, and I'm going to break down and explain to you what it shows. Okay, so he explains that the document, the name, this document here, this document represents one of the unknowns, one of the unknown documents, the one that we don't know whether FDR wrote it or not. What these documents here represent, what these represent here, the ones that I'm highlighting, what these represent is the pools of writing that we know the person wrote. Okay, so the JFK pool, the Twining pool, the Truman pool. Okay, we think the ones that we know they wrote. Okay, so going back to here. Okay, the ones we know they wrote, the known ones. Okay, so what each of these is showing you is whichever one of these that I'm highlighting, whichever one is closest to the top, that is the one that is the closest match to the FDR document. So what this first one shows you is that this FDR document, this unknown FDR document that we're trying to figure out, it's Q1. Okay, so we go back to here. It's this one. Okay, it's this one. What the chart is showing you, whoops. What it's showing you is the closest match to this FDR document is the JFK pool. So what does that tell you? What that tells you is the FDR document does not match FDR's other writing, which you see is over here. Right? It's fourth from the top. The one that is closest to the top is the one that's the closest match. And Heiser tells us that it's not a scale. So like it's possible that, oh, if maybe the FDR was in the second spot, it might be better. He says only the one that's in this top one can be considered a match with 95% certainty. Okay, the other ones are not matches. Okay, so what this tells you is that this first document, this FDR document that was part of the Majestic Documents, is a forgery. It was not written by FDR. Okay, because the FDR one would be closest to the top if it were a match. Okay, look at this one. Don't worry about the turquoise. His document, his study explains what that is, but for the purposes of this, we don't have to worry about it. Look at the Eisenhower one, Eisenhower Q1. So that's, if we flip back, it's this one. Whoops. This one. Okay. So Eisenhower. So what does this tell us? Again, looking at it, what's the closest match? It's the JFK pool. So what this is telling us is this unknown Eisenhower document was not written by Eisenhower. It more closely matches the writing we know JFK did. Okay. And one thing that Heiser notices, and maybe you noticed just flipping through here, it seems like all of these unknown Majestic 12 documents, the top match seems to be JFK every time. And so what Heiser concludes from this is perhaps these documents were all forged by the same person. This person was using JFK's writing style to forge these documents, because all of them seem to have JFK as the top match. Now, not here, but a lot of them are, I think 7 of them, he said, all have JFK as their closest match. So what that shows is that whoever's doing these forgeries is relying on JFK's writing style. Now, what we want to look for with the document that we know, the document that we've looked at, the primary source we've looked at, is this memo from Nathan Twining. That's the one we're concerned about. Is this one a match? So far, not so good. We've got, it seems like a bunch of forgeries here. So back to here. So just remind ourselves, which document are we looking at? We're looking for Nathan Twining to General George Solgen. That's the third document. So that's Twining Q3. That's the one we want to find. Twining Q3, that's the unknown or the unverified one that we want to know whether it's authentic or not. Okay, so let's flip. Let's find that one. Okay. Twining Q3. Okay. What does this show us? What can we conclude from looking at this chart here? Good news if you are a UFO conspiracy theorist, okay? Because what this tells us is that Twining's memo, the memo that I just showed you, this one was absolutely, we know from the testing, this one was written by Twining himself. Okay, top match is Twining. Okay, so from the Twining pool with the writings we know he did, this document matches those in terms of word choice, sentence structure, all that stuff. This document is a match. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that UFOs are real and we can start cheering in the streets that UFOs are real and it doesn't mean that. All Heiser tells us is that what that means is that this document here, this document was written by Nathan Twining. The content of it is a different story. The content of it might be disputed. Twining might be mistaken, but we know from Heiser's test here that Twining did write that memo.